Thank you so much for attending the first seminar of the Democracy and Defense blog at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge country. We meet on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and we acknowledge past, present, and elders. And before we start, I'd love to welcome Dr. Benedicte Laumond, I hope I'm saying that right, who is an assistant professor at the University of Versailles. She's also taking part in the project Populism and Democratic Defence in Europe, where she investigates the German case. Benedicte's research focuses on the regulation of right-wing radicalism in Europe and on the perception of crime in France and Germany. She's also the author of Policy Responses to the Radical Right in France and Germany, Public Actors, Policy Frames, and Decision Making. And if Benedicte wants to, she could just put the link for that book on the chat, so that we could all access it. And now over to Benedicte.
Okay, I'll just send the link after the presentation because I'm a bit overwhelmed at the moment with all the screen sharing stuff. Okay, so here we are. Just going to make it big. Can you hear me properly, all of you? Yeah? Okay. So then I will start. So thanks, Anna, for the presentation. So yes, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Versailles, and I'm still working again on the regulation of right-wing radicalism in Europe, specifically in France and Germany. So I wanted to say a few words or to present on first my doctoral research, and then say a few words on the current project I'm working on, since both of them are really well connected. So it all started actually in 2011, so more than 10 years ago now, because at that time I was interning in the German federal parliament in the office of an MP who happened at that time to be the speaker of her party for, I quote, strategies against right-wing extremism. So during this internship, I basically discovered not only her work and her activities, but also that the German state had developed a policy against so-called right-wing extremism. And of course, this all aroused my curiosity. And I asked myself, how come we, the French, with a powerful Front National, so the right-wing radical party, have not done so? So in 2013, 2 years later, I started a comparative PhD to find answers in a way. And I wanted to show you an empirical illustration of this difference that helped me building really a comparative puzzle. So I chose 3 excerpts from interviews conducted in Germany and in France with, let's say, judges, magistrates. So the first one is a German prosecutor in Germany. And during that interview, I asked him at some point, how did you come up, quite at the beginning actually, how did you come up against the issue of right-wing radicalism when you became general prosecutor in your region? And he said, I began dealing with this issue in December 1993, as soon as I became the head of the prosecution department in Neuruppin. The former concentration camps, Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück, are in this jurisdiction. There had already been incidents of this nature. It was very important for me to prosecute offenses with a right-wing extremist motivation, and I put in much effort in developing a coherent enforcement strategy against right-wing extremism with lists of persons who had repeatedly committed criminal offenses. So when they committed another offense, we reacted with harsher penalties. And when I became general prosecutor in 1996, I thought, now we need to intensify the prosecution against right-wing extremists statewide. That was before that. When I was doing my interviews in France, I also met with a French prosecutor. I think that was a woman, and I started presenting my focus. I'm interested in knowing more about how the French and German states respond to what I call the radical right, what police officers in France at least often call the ultra-right, and what you prosecutors, and she cut me and answered, do not call anything. And similarly, a few years afterwards, as I was meeting up with an administrative judge of the highest administrative jurisdiction in France, he was telling me, actually, we do not put a label on political cases. Therefore, one cannot say that we adjudicate cases concerning one particular political ideology. If you look in the table of contents of the Le Bon volume, so these are important books for administrative lawyers, there is no section called extreme right. So I actually like these statements because they show, I think, two very contrasting ways of addressing right-wing radicalism. Whereas the German prosecutor expressly names right-wing extremism as an issue that he addresses on a daily basis, the two French magistrates, in contrast, do not apply a label to the radical right or right-wing extremism. In doing so, or rather in not doing so, the French respondents here unknowingly refer to the paradox of tolerance that I could reformulate under the question, how can liberal democracies develop responses, including repressive ones, to a political phenomenon? So I think it's important. To say that my whole doctoral research was based on the idea that liberal democracies deal with right-wing radicalism in different ways empirically. And it led me to formulate the following research question, that is, how have French and German public actors produced their own approaches towards right-wing radicalism? And how has this approach shaped the way in which they, so these actors, regulate radicalism nowadays? So I first want to make it clear which definition I have from right-wing radicalism, because that's some kind of slippery path, since I have the feeling that many scientists use different notions or concepts. So I took the definition in the German-speaking context of Michael Minkenberg that I combined in a way with the ones from Kasmuda. So for me, right-wing radicalism is a political ideology whose core element is the myth of a homogeneous nation, a romantic and populist ultranationalism directed against liberal democracy and its underlying values, such as individualism or universalism. And in this ideology, the idealized nation should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, and non-native elements are fundamentally threatening to the homogeneous nation state. Okay, so still following Minkenberg's definition, there are at least three types of right-wing radical organizations, that is political parties, social movements, but also the subcultural milieu. And then in my doctoral research, that's something that I'm trying to broaden now, I only took into account policy responses to right-wing radicalism. So that's what my talk is going to be about. And as you might have noticed, my approach is anchored in policy studies. And I try to address the role played by actors, by policymakers. And to do so, I sought to investigate their perceptions, their ideas, and finally, their interactions. So here, maybe I can send you the PowerPoint if you have some interest in French and German politics. I try to develop some kind of matrix of the radical right applied to France and Germany. Some of you seem to be German speakers, so I guess you'll be familiar with the German parts, but I added the French parts as well to make sense of what is the radical right empirically in both countries. Okay, so like I said, my research question was operationalized by an approach anchored in policy studies. Why? Because my intuition at the beginning, also because I studied policy policy. I was in the field of policy studies as a master's student. Probably it influenced it. It had a great influence on me. But I had the intuition that this literature from policy field was not much used in the field of far right studies, but I thought that it could help us say something new, maybe, on how to respond to this kind of phenomenon. And therefore, my theoretical ambition was to import some tools of policy studies in the far right studies and see whether they are useful. So I actually explored the literature on the role of frames, specifically policy frames. So just a quick definition provided by Eric Bleich. Policy frames are a set of cognitive and moral maps that orient an actor within a policy sphere. And the work of Eric Bleich was really important for me because some of you might be familiar with his work, but he revealed a causal relationship between race frames and race policies in a comparative work between France and Great Britain. And he demonstrates that the role of ideas is important to understand policy outcomes. So here in this case, it was the importance of the legal responses against racism and hate speech in France and Great Britain based on the policy frames of different categories of actors. So reading his work, I was inspired and thought, okay, in the context of my research, one might reasonably suppose that the policy frames to be identified among state actors who address the radical right, those frames might impact the regulation of right-wing radicalism quite strongly. And I therefore explored how right-wing radicalism has been framed in both countries and also the consequences of those frames, of those cognitive maps on the regulation of the radical right nowadays. Of course, I tried to connect this literature anchored really in policy studies with the comparative literature on far right studies and responses to radical right. I didn't put all the references because I thought it might not be the most central thing to discuss today, but I was, of course, inspired by the work of Ami Pédasour, who developed at the beginning of the 2000s, a threefold classification of models of democratic defense against right-wing extremism. So you might be familiar with this classification, but he started by developing a first category, the so-called militant route, understood by Pédasour as a route relevant for regimes that either suffer from continuous attacks by extremely violent challengers, or democracies that are not founded on strong liberal tradition. So what does that mean? That means that those democracies, those militant democracies in a way, restrict their responses to a repressive arsenal without antidotes to anti-democratic movements among society. So in this regard, post-war Germany was a remarkable example of militant democracy. Then there's a second category, the so-called defending democracies, which refer to a liberal system that's, I quote, might consider flexing the boundaries of the rule of law to enable a proper response to the challenge when the democracy is under attack. And that means that those democracies are not so militant as the previous ones, but when judged necessary, they might resort to some militant democratic tools. But in the same time, these are states which also introduced measures promoting, for instance, civic education to damn movements attempting to dismantle the rule of law. So that was the second category. And then the third one, the so-called immunized route, So in terms of liberality, this option, of course, goes one step further than defending democracy and is characterized, I quote again, by a delicate mechanism of checks and balances. So the assumption in those states is that states reach a phase when civil society becomes an independent but also powerful actor. And they have much responsibility to defend the democratic order. And in conclusion, Pedazur classifies the German model as a model in transition, moving from the defending to the so-called humanized routes. So I found it all really interesting, but I thought it was necessary to adopt a meso and micro level approach. It was, for me at least, important to be more specific about actual responses and the logic of those responses. And also, I didn't learn much about the French case. So that's why I started my research. So here is a summary table inspired also by the work of Giovanni Capoccia to try to order the different kinds of strategies and responses that are in fact, addressed through right-wing radicalism generally. And you will notice that I, at least in my doctoral research, only focused on policy responses. So I kind of excluded party politics also because I had the feeling that there's already literature, and there was literature also 5, 6, 7 years ago on that issue. So then the question was, how did I do that? Again, I explore how 2 states have regulated right-wing radicalism. So to this end, I rely on qualitative field research conducted in both countries, obviously in France and Germany. And in order to generate knowledge and hopefully a fruitful comparative analysis, I conducted 80 in-depth interviews, which were conducted on a semi-structured basis with actors from different state institutions. So from the police, from the intelligence service, from justice or judges, but also from social ministries. And I also conducted interviews with NGOs or representatives from NGOs countering right-wing radical groups. And thanks to the dialogue between me and the respondents, I think that subjective perspectives could actually emerge, considering that literature on the responses to radical right has hardly addressed the representations of policymakers, conducted interviews with a range of public actors dealing with this phenomenon, with different policy instruments, of course, seemed to me to be a promising approach. So how did I organize this field work? I first organized a preparatory field work in Germany, conducted between February and March 2013. It was for my master's research at that time. And since my knowledge of the German case was already extensive when I started at PhD, end of 2013, I decided to begin with the French fieldwork, which was conducted between December 2013 through November 2014, and then later on between November 2016 and March 2017 in order to gather complementary information, especially regarding public law judges. And in Germany, the fieldwork took place between January 2015 and January 2016. In each country, the interviews were conducted over a large time span, as you noticed, for 2 reasons. First, the access to respondents was quite complicated, especially in the French case, with actors working for the police from the intelligence service as well. And second, this time span allowed me to go back and forth between the data analysis and the research of appropriate literature in order to further develop the interview sampling and to adjust the interview grid, so the questions, for future respondents in accordance with the last stage of the analysis, because you might have gotten the sense that my research was in some parts inductive. So I didn't start the whole process with very clear hypotheses. So that's why the fieldwork was organized this way. Okay, so what are my main results? Of course, that's something that we can discuss again during the discussion, especially if you want more details about what the actors exactly told me. So first results. To begin with, I compared the historical developments of responses to radical right in France and Germany based on, the literature of on right-wing radical movements, on historical movements, and it appears that France has seen the emergence of a hegemonic radical right-wing party, so the Front National, now called Rassemblement National or National Rally, whereas the German radical right has long been and stayed fragmented between its different extremist components. The French Front National has been an old electoral threat, or perceived as such. In contrast, German radical right parties have not managed to establish themselves as long-lasting political forces, at least until the AfD appeared in the past decade. However, in Germany, the subcultural radical right has thrived, especially since reunification. But again, in contrast, the French subcultural right has remained weak. So in light of these differences, I first discussed the various responses formulated against the radical right. And maybe surprisingly, we can notice that France and Germany have been using similar instruments in order to repress right-wing radicalism. And similar patterns could be observed as well. For instance, in the 1950s, we saw the progressive reintegration of former Nazi followers into the German civil service. And not even a decade later, so during the 60s, this decade also saw former right-wing activists from the right-wing terrorist OAS in Algeria granted amnesty in France. So similar pattern, despite different structure of the radical right in both countries. A second result is then presented because I sought to identify a policy frame in the two countries, a dominating policy frame in the two countries under investigation based on their legislation and the development of their legislation in the last century. What I find is a central distinction between France and Germany in this case. Because in Germany, addressing political radicalism is a policy matter, which has experienced several developments. So framing political radicalism as a policy issue was a result of the German legacy, so the National Socialist era, and it has not been particularly influenced by the characteristics of the radical right, the fact, for instance, that there's a strong extremist subculture. In France, it was way more challenging to identify a comprehensive frame. I think that the underlying rationale has been marked by the belief that political radicalism should not be addressed in policy terms unless the groups are violent or express openly racist opinions. Therefore, the French legal framework has developed a very heterogeneous set of measures enabling the repression of right-wing radicalism. So there are three ways of doing that. First, there are the historical anti-fascist provisions. For instance, the fact that you can proscribe or ban groups that jeopardize territorial integrity or who jeopardize the republican form of governance. So these are the laws of the 1930s. That's why they're called anti-fascist provisions. Then you have regulations pertaining to the maintenance of law and order. So far, for instance, the repression of violent acts causing grievous bodily harm. So classical way to repress violence. And the third way to repress the radical right is to use the anti-racist legislation passed in the 1970s in France. So the repression of racist crime, the repression as well of hate speech. So in sum, between France and Germany, when it comes to a policy frame, we are in very different cases. So then I asked myself, okay, that's all interesting, really, but what are the consequences of having, or in the French case, not having framed the radical right as a policy on the responses that are implemented nowadays against right-wing radicalism? Is it that important? So to do so, I explored whether there were consequences and used the interviews to provide an answer. So surprise, it does. So it does have an impact to frame the repression of right-wing radicalism as a policy issue or not. In Germany, I find that framing right-wing radicalism as a policy issue, plus the fact that there are some specificities in German policymaking, for instance, the fact that we are in a federal country where political power is shared between many policymakers, which is much less the case in France. The combination of those two factors makes it so that policymakers, including civil society actors in Germany, have managed to structure a preventive policy against right-wing radicalism, especially after reunification, so in the 1990s and then in the 2000s. So I find in the German case a great diversification of the policy mix against right-wing radicalism, which can also explain what Pedazo was saying at the beginning, the fact that Germany seems to be moving from a defending democracy to a immunized democracy. In France, where right-wing radicalism has been framed as a political issue first, it's interesting to note that this framing has not hindered civil society groups, also anti-fascist groups, from addressing right-wing radicalism, especially because in the 1970s in France, there were many racist attacks conducted all over the country by far-right groups. And then in the 80s and the 90s, the Front National appeared and experienced some success. So of course, there were responses from civil society. But what I note is that there was, at the same time, relative passivity of state actors regarding the development of preventive responses to right-wing radicalism, which means that the civil society group which organized to implement new strategies combating the Front National, for instance, these were not supported by the state. They were not public funded, whereas it strongly is the case in Germany. And what I show with my interviews is that the mobilization of those actors decreased, especially in the 2000s, because in the 2000s you might have you might not know that or have forgotten that, but the Front National experienced losses after 2002, so that civil society actors who were much committed to that cause in the 1990s progressively committed themselves to other causes. And that's why when the Front National was experiencing new success with Marine Le Pen at the beginning of the 2010s, those well-structured organizations from the 1990s did not reform, and the state did not fund them either. So that's why I show that there's weak prevention against right-wing radicalism in France. And that's especially striking because there is strong prevention against Islamism funded by the state since 10 years now. So there's really a difference when the problem is framed as a political issue, such as the radical right, or not, such as it's the case with Islamism. So that's why I argue that framing has an impact on the policy mix against the radical right, but it also has an impact on how policymakers interact. What I show in an analysis of the regulation of right-wing radical demonstrations, so mainly on the actions of the police, judges, political actors in this area, I show that Germany is characterized by an interdependence of actors in the policymaking process against the radical right, also because actors from the police are very much constrained by the actions of the judges. By contrast, and the comparison is really enlightening, I think, French policymaking is much more compartmentalized, which means that the police actors are freer to react as they are used to do against the radical right demonstrating in the streets, unless, and that's an important exception, political actors decide to intervene. Because again, it's framed as a political issue. So political actors are perceived, are deemed as the most important actors when it comes to the regulation of that political phenomenon. But this political intervention in the regulation of the radical right is extremely rare. So in fact, the policymaking that happens anyways is much more compartmentalized, and there is less auto-regulation by the actors because they are not constrained by other state actors. So to conclude, I argue that two factors help to understand the regulatory dynamics of right-wing radicalism, at least in France and Germany, but I hope that it can be generalized. That's the historical framing of the radical right, plus national policymaking specificities. Again, the fact that you have a federal country and a more centralist country on the other hand, the fact that the judges in the German policymaking process are central actors, whereas it's not as much the case in France. And that plays a huge role on the actual regulation of political radicalism on a daily basis. So I wanted to conclude with maybe the limits of that research, because all researchers have limits. You might have noticed that I didn't address much the role of one important radical right player in Germany, that is the Alternative für Deutschland. So the Alternative for Germany that emerged in 2013 and much more in 2015 with the first big successes. And neither did I address the relationship between policy responses, what I did in my PhD, and responses with the political, within the political arena, so party politics. And this is something that I now explore in a new project called Populism and Democratic Defence that I work with different European colleagues. So what have we done so far? The two questions that I started answering are: what does characterize the German pattern of responses to the AfD specifically? So in order to do that, we mapped the initiatives opposing the AfD since 2013 until 2021. And based on that, I show, or I argue at least, it's not out yet, that Germany has developed an adapted militancy towards the AfD, mixing tolerant and intolerant modes of engagement. And that database also reveals changes in practice over time, as if policy, state, civil society, political actors had adapted to the AfD between 2013 and 2021. And of course, my second question is, well, then how does one explain the developments of initiatives opposing the AfD between 2013 and 2021? And in order to give an answer to that, I explore three case studies. First, why did the Christian Social Union, so the Bavarian conservatives, you can say, how did they go from ostracizing and at the same time co-opting parts of the AfD program to just ostracizing this party? Why did they stop co-opting as largely as they did in 2016? Second case, how public authorities in Germany managed to monitor the AfD, because the AfD is now monitored by the intelligence service. And third case, how or were NGOs challenged by the institutionalization of the AfD? And if so, because yes, that's the case, how did they adapt? And I finally conclude that all those evolutions can be explained by first, the radicalization of the AfD, second, the militant democratic past of Germany, so it's still here, the legacy at least, and also by the distribution of power between the authors of initiatives opposing AfD, who all need to adapt to their own institutional constraint, because as an intelligence service, you may monitor a party as a civil society project funded by public funds. You may not, and you have to remain tolerant in a way, even if you want to contain the AfD as much as you can. So my outlooks for that research are now to research indeed the effects of these initiatives on the AfD, because the AfD seems now, at least in the German case, to be quite contained, which is not the case in many European countries. And of course, one of my questions is, were those initiatives successful in containing the party or not? Okay, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.